Let's look at this narrative, and we're gonna hit it head on, because it's starting to get aggravating. That every time you'll talk about any team that's off to a bad, you could have a team that's off to an 0-15 starts. People will go, "Yeah, I remember St. Louis now. St. Louis looked dead and buried." No, they didn't. At no point last year was St. Louis dead and buried. The problem for St. Louis last year was they lost a lot of games early in the year at home, and they'd have to win on the road, and then they won on the road. But the narrative, of course, comes from, hey, January 3rd, the morning of January 3rd, they were last overall. Yeah. So I know that makes a great story, and I know it's been all over the media and everything, but I'm going to debunk some of that just a little bit, just a tiny bit. In October, they were 3-4-3. It was a disappointing start because this was a team that everybody picked to make the playoffs. Everybody picked them, usually to finish third in the division. Early on, it looked like that wasn't going to happen. Ryan O'Reilly, it was mixed results early on, and their goaltending was a problem. Jake Allen, everybody hoped for a bounce back. That wasn't happening. Binnington wasn't a thing yet. 6-8-0 record in November. During November, they fired Mike Yeo, and they brought in Craig Berube. It took a while for Berube's system to hit. But at the end of this month, they're 9-12-3. They're 3 games below 500. It is not in the realm of this team's terrible. It was just there were a lot of problems going on, but it wasn't something that couldn't be fixed. This is why the general manager didn't go out and panic. In the month of December, they were 6-6-1. I remember vividly saying during reviews, if they could put together a winning streak, they'd be great. And even in their losses, they're playing well. Nobody knows because the schedule so far hasn't given them much of a chance. In the month of January, they went 7-4-1, right? And then after that, it's all gangbusters. February, they're 12-1-1. March, they're 8-5-2. In April, they're 3-0-1. And then they won the Stanley Cup in June. So everybody just loves this. So what a great story. They were last overall. They were last overall because they didn't play as many games as everybody else. Dear Lord. People make it sound like St. Louis was this miserable team and they weren't a miserably bad team. January 3rd, the morning of January 3rd after the games of January 2nd, well, there are birds flying through the sky, I assume, depending on where you live. Not as many in Vegas. Carolina was 16-7-5. They had 37 points. They were 1 game below 500. New Jersey, 15-7-7, 37 points. They were 2 games below 500. Detroit was 15-20-7, 37 points, 5 games below 500. Philadelphia, 15-19-5, 35 points, 4 games below 500. The LA Kings, 16-22-3, 35 points, 6 games below 500. Here's LA, 15-18-4. St. Louis, 15-18-4, 34 points. Yes, they were last, but they were only 3 games below 500. They were not worse than the LA Kings. They were not worse than Philadelphia or Detroit when you looked at the record. And then Chicago, special mention to Chicago here at 15-21-6, 36 points, but 6 games below 500. Same number of wins. They played 5 more games than St. Louis and managed a healthy 2 points in overtime or shootout losses. The St. Louis Blues were never the worst team in the league. They never fell that far out of the playoffs. They never fell beyond that. About 10 points. Once you get beyond 10 points out of the playoffs, you're looking at probably being done. They never got to that. So January 3rd, they defeated the Capitals 5-2. Jordan Allen's in net. They go to 17-18-4 and would have leapfrogged teams in front of them. So by the end of January 3rd, they weren't 31st anymore, and they never really were a 31st place team. They had a lot of new guys that came in, and it took them a while to get things figured out. And after firing the coach, it took a while for Craig Berube's system to come into play. But they were never that bad. This is why when I talk right now about Detroit and I talk about the Ottawa Senators, they're in positions where they just look really bad. And you don't see them in a position where they can be 1 game below 500 by the end of the month. Or 3 games below 500 by the end of November. There are situations where that could happen. Detroit looked good early in the year. Maybe they get, but for Ottawa, they really look overmatched. The St. Louis Blues, the morning of January 3rd, had played 37 games. The lowest number of games played by any team in the National Hockey League. The most games played was Vancouver's with 43. Vancouver had 44 points in those 43 games. There were parts during last year where the Vancouver Canucks were in the playoffs because they played more games than everybody else. But all people looked at was, hey, as of this date, the Canucks were in a playoff spot and then they fell out. Don't look at games in hand as if they don't exist. Now, I've said before, games in hand are tricky. You've got to win them. St. Louis did. When the schedule evened out, St. Louis went out there and won it. When I said St. Louis has to win games on the road, they did. And then they started winning at home. This idea that, well, the Blues were the worst team in the league and look what they did, it's not really true. 15 and 22 if you take overtime losses and make them losses. 15 and 24 for Philadelphia. 16 and 25 for LA. 15 and 27 for Chicago. So again, 15 and 22 is not great, but it is not the worst in the league. They were never the worst team in the league. And they were a team that was considered to be dramatically underperforming. This was a team that wasn't supposed to be a bad team. They were supposed to be a playoff team. It is a completely different scenario. And then they ended up being a playoff team and went on this run and won a Stanley Cup. So I understand the narrative being, hey, they were last overall. Don't forget the Blues. Don't forget the Blues. Well, yeah, Carolina was one game below 500. They made the playoffs. Chicago didn't. LA didn't. Philly didn't. Detroit didn't. New Jersey didn't. So the narrative is out there, and I understand that narrative being there, and I know why people want to push this as, hey, there's still hope. But for the most part, usually there isn't. Usually if a team is down and out once you get to January, they're probably still going to be out around playoff time. And the smart general manager is the one that looks at a team like here's LA 16, 22, and 3 and says, all right, we're going to have to tear things apart, which LA eventually did. And in St. Louis's case, Doug Armstrong looked at this and said, well, we haven't played as many games as everybody else. We'll let it play out. And not only that, but he was thinking about tearing things down, and he went and did some stuff, came back, and the record was getting better. So he thought, all right, I'll leave it alone. And again, St. Louis never really fell that far out. They weren't far enough out for anybody to consider them to be done. Whereas some of these other teams were. Because again, if you haven't played that number of games, you're going to have less of a chance of getting as many points. If St. Louis had played 41 games, if they played 4 more games at this stage, they likely would have had at least 3 more points. And then instead of saying, well, they were last overall in January, it would have been, well, they weren't in the playoffs in January. I get it. It's a great talking point, but it drives me insane because they were never the worst team in the league. That was never the St. Louis Blues. They were never the worst team in the league. They were always a pretty good team that was underperforming, and then they realized that potential. Starting in December, really, in all honesty, they started playing better in December, and then January, the record finally started reflecting it. All right. That's it for me. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. And again, I'll just link to this video from here going forward. When people say, hey, what about the Blues? Yeah, the Blues were never the worst team in the league. They were last overall because they didn't play as many games. You can look at teams right now that have only played 7 games compared to 10 and go, oh, they don't have as many points. But it looks kind of silly if their win-loss record tells you they'll likely make up the difference. And with the way the NHL schedule is, we often have teams that have a ton of games in hand. And I've always thought that was weird. I've always thought that's unfair to teams that have those games in hand because they're going to have a tougher schedule that second half. But at the same time, for a team that plays all those games early on, you might say, you know what, we've played 5 more games than that team. It's not fair to us because we've just been killed the first half of the season. Yeah, let them work for it in the second half. St. Louis did, and they made it. Again, it's such a silly narrative. And the interesting thing, too, and I want to point this out, January 3rd when they defeated the Caps, it was Jake Allen that was in net. Jake Allen in the next game then allowed 4 goals on 14 shots. It was not a great night for him. Only allowing 14 shots, you should win that game. And the game following that, Jordan Binnington went in net, and he scored himself a shutout. So the storyline of what happened with St. Louis, to me, is overly simplified when people say, well, they were last in the league, and look what they did. They weren't supposed to be last in the league. They were supposed to be an excellent team. They were at the very least supposed to be better with Ryan O'Reilly in the lineup and with all the star players that they had at their disposal. Vlad Tarasenko had rough patches to the season, and there was times where it felt like they might trade him. There were plenty of rumors that Tarasenko might end up getting moved, and then afterwards, he recovers, the Blues recover, and history remembers things differently. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And thank you guys so much for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.